My name is Michelle. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Management Association International. We're very, very glad to have you here today for today's seminar. This seminar series, the research seminars in finance, economics, and banking, are a collaboration between FMA and the Finance, Economics, and Banking Research Network, which we nicknamed FEBRN. We've got two members of this network here today that are going to kick this off. So Cesario, with no further ado, I pass on to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and a warm welcome to everyone. So as Michelle said, FEBRN is in partnership with FMA in the organization of these research seminars in finance, economics, and banking. And FEBRN is a collaboration of more than 25 universities worldwide. Georgios Panos, a friend and colleague and professor of finance at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Greece, one of the FEBRN university partners, will moderate our seminar today. So I pass to you, Georgios, and you take it from here.
Thank you, Cesario. Thank you, Michelle. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor George Constantinides for today's seminar. Professor Constantinides is a professor at finance at Chicago Booth. He's a graduate of Oxford University and Indiana University. He has served as the president of both the American Finance Association and the Society for Financial Studies. His work has been most influential and seminal in several fields. Between them, we can see the premium of equity returns over bond returns, the value premium, the size premium, the pricing and hedging of derivatives, the effects of sentiment on development and productivity, which is also the theme of today's talk by Professor Constantinides, household finance, and many, many more. So without further ado, Professor Constantinides, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for today's seminar.
Thank you all for attending this presentation. And in particular, I would like to thank Cesario, Georgios, and Michelle for making this possible. So my plan is to talk for about 40 minutes, and I'm very interested in your questions, and I hope we have time to address your questions. It should not take me very long to tell the story because, as you'll see, the story is simple, and I find it pretty compelling. Incidentally, all my earlier research was with super rational players, investors, and this is my first experimentation with looking at the less perhaps rational aspect of investors' expectations, the sentiment. So I'm excited about this project, and actually I'm in the process of having a follow-up paper on this. This research is joined with Mauricio Montone from the University of Utrecht, Valerio Podi from the University College Dublin, and Stella Spigliotti from the University of Athens University of Economics and Business. So there's a growing body of evidence that shows that business cycles are mainly driven by expectations. And what do we mean by expectations? And you'll see there are different views, whether they're rational or not. And this is the focus of this paper, to analyze what expectations are and what is sentiment. So there is two main categories of way of thinking about it. The one by Pigou that says that expectations are businessmen's beliefs. So this is kind of a rational approach, that the businessmen's beliefs are based on fundamentals, and therefore they have they are rational, and they have an effect on the investment, productivity, and so forth. And the second one, at the other extreme, in Lord Keynes, expectations that he called animal spirits, that says that these expectations have no bearing whatsoever to the real economy. So we'll figure out which of these, or something in between, are expectations and sentiment in which category do they fall, and also, and that's the first contribution, and the second one, to pinpoint the channel through which expectations affect the macroeconomy. So again, here are the three hypotheses. The first one is that sentiment anticipates growth but does not cause it, and will flatly reject this hypothesis. And just to anticipate what is coming, I'm looking at expectations sort of driven by changes in weather, sunshine days, basically. And there is no way that sunshine anticipates macroeconomic news. So that's going to be, that's why we're going to flatly reject the hypothesis that sentiment anticipates growth but does not cause it. The second one is that sentiment has no relation to fundamentals, so it only generates short-lived economic fluctuations. And most of the earlier empirical evidence, which was conducted for the United States, finds support for this. But we'll distinguish that the effect of sentiment, or countries with sophisticated investors, sophisticated financial markets, and countries with less sophisticated financial markets, and we find that it has very little relation with fundamentals in the very advanced countries like the US, but it does have a relation to fundamentals in less advanced countries. And the third hypothesis is that sentiment creates a self-fulfilling feedback loop with an immediate and lasting effect on economic growth. And again, we'll find that the effect in the more advanced countries is minimal, is very short-lived and very small, while in the less advanced countries, the sentiment does create a self-fulfilling feedback, increases investment productivity, and that has a lasting effect. Okay. So this paper will propose a novel solution to this problem by going to a cross-country setting. As I said, most of the early research was focused on the US, but we get all these additional insights by looking at different countries that we are going to group in two groupings, and we'll do variation in the groupings and also have some tests that avoid any particular grouping. But essentially, we think of countries which are, if they are large and they have advanced financial markets, that would be the first group. The second group is there are smaller countries with less advanced financial markets and less financial sophistication, that they can confuse sentiment for being something grounded on the macroeconomic expectations. All right. So, as I said, this is a very imperfect grouping of the countries, and we'll do it in many different ways, and we'll show that the results are pretty robust to how we group the countries. So we show that, so we start with 21. Let me just go forward. Yeah, we start with 21 OECD countries, and we group them in these 6 countries, the advanced group, and the remaining 11 as the less advanced group. And we'll argue that there is a lower, we will show there is lower macro uncertainty with respect to the relative to the non-G7 countries. And that stock returns exhibit less mispricing than in non-G7 countries. But you'll see all that in the form of tables. All right, so here are the 2 groupings. In G7 countries, high sentiment, and I'll define exactly what is the source of sentiment, and we'll split it into two components. But this is just an overview, is that in the G7 countries, sentiment moderately increases economic growth and has no relation to future productivity and is very short-lived. In contrast, in the non-G7 countries, the high sentiment, substantially increases economic growth, correspondingly increases future productivity, and that's consistent with the third story, the third hypothesis, and and it has a persistent effect. So this is what I'm going to show through a series of tables in grouping the data in different ways. All right. So Ben Habib and his co-authors developed a theoretical model where stock prices represent a noisy signal for future economic growth. And there is high noise, sentiment, when there is high noise, which is what we observe in the less advanced economies, sentiment is mistaken for fundamentals, and there is overpricing that creates self-fulfilling business cycles. Okay. So consistent with the sentiment story, you find evidence that sentiment is followed by lower stock returns because the sentiment increases right away, the price raises the price, and then there is a recognition that that sentiment has no economic basis, and then the prices go down. Now, in the advanced countries, we'll see that the correction takes place within the first year. In the less advanced countries, it takes longer for the people to realize that that sentiment has no economic basis. Then we'll also show that sentiment creates an aggregate shift in from credit to equity. And again, this occurs is confined to the non-G7 countries. Essentially, high sentiment raises the stock prices. With high stock prices, firms find it preferable to issue equity than short-term credit, or issue bonds. And the third one is that managers exploit sentiment through market timing. We'll see all that in the tables. Okay. And previous research shows that sentiment has a temporary and small effect on growth. And again, this is confined, or at least these studies were only in the US. And we'll exploit the cross-country variation, and we see that the financial sophistication of a country plays a big role in distinguishing between hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3. Okay. Okay. So the method is, here is the consumer macroeconomic outcomes we obtain. Here is the source. Now the consumer confidence is provided by the OECD and captures country-specific sentiment and is key to identifying local transmission. And the other data we need is price-dividend ratios, which you obtain from the websites of Ken French and Bob Schiller. So, and the study covers a period 1975 to 2019. So, main sample consists of the top 17 OECD countries, but also later on we'll also include the remaining OECD countries. But for the first results, we have the 6 G7 countries: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, UK, and the US. And the second group is the 11 countries out of the top 21 that are non-G7. And right away, I don't want to make a big deal. This classification is imperfect. For example, most of the countries in the second group are financially very sophisticated, but this is just a rough cut. And as I said, we'll regroup the countries in different ways and show that the results are robust. Okay, so in the last sentence says you also explored the full sample of the 42 countries, and through that we create a third group of the remaining OECD countries, and we show that the effect of sentiment is even strongest for the third group, which are the less financially sophisticated countries. All right. Okay. So the OECD consumer confidence indices, they come from surveys. Okay. And I'll contrast that with another index, which is the investor confidence index. But the one we use is a consumer confidence index, and it's obtained from surveys of households, and captures economic expectations, and there are country-specific economic expectations, and they're the short term. The important thing is that these surveys are done in a consistent fashion across the countries, so that gives us some confidence that the index measures something which sort of is varies across countries, and it also refers to the consumer confidence in the country where the survey is conducted. And at the bottom, I say the reason we do not use investor sentiment is because there is no widely accepted measure and for that, and is not based on surveys, but rather based on extracting investor sentiment out of the current state of the macro economy. And we want to distinguish between two aspects of the sentiment, as I'll show shortly, that the total sentiment is partly based on the macro economy and partly based on something which is unrelated, a component which is unrelated to the macro economy. So we want to look separately at the effect of these two components. It does make sense that if the economy is doing well, all the macroeconomic variables are positive, then to some extent that will boost consumer confidence. But this is not what we are looking for. We are not looking at how the macro variables affect investment and returns and so forth. We want to look at the orthogonal component to that, the component that is not based on the macro economy. And we'll show very explicitly how we separate the total sentiment to its two components. If we were to use instead the investor sentiment, that is based on the macroeconomy. So this is not the component we would be missing out. The component of the sentiment we are interested in that is not based on the current level of the macroeconomy. Okay, so in equation 1 states what we are doing in most of the analysis. The left-hand side variable is the quantity that is affected, and it could be investment, it could be productivity, GDP, consumption, employment, inflation, labor share, and so forth. And we'll do them separately. For the moment, just think of the left-hand side as being investment. And we want to see then how investment is based on the sentiment. So on the right-hand side, the variable in red is the total sentiment. Now, it's a total sentiment, but as I said, we want to separate out the sentiment into the rational component based on the macroeconomy and the component which is not related to the macroeconomy. But the variable that is provided by the surveys is the total sentiment. Now, therefore, on the right-hand side, in addition to having fixed effects, the alpha C and the alpha T, we also have the vector of macro variables, okay, country level macro variables, okay, and these are GDP, consumption, employment, labor share, and inflation. And because we have that, any dependence of the sentiment, the red variable, independent variable, on the macroeconomy is going to be absorbed by the vector Z of the country level macro variables. Therefore, the coefficient beta 1 is going to be the effect, as I say at the bottom, the effect of the orthogonalized component of the sentiment to the variable on the left, say investment. Okay, so we achieve that in two ways. In the first way, which is what makes better econometric sense, is we have the, we say one stage regression, time series regression of change in investment on the left-hand side on the total sentiment with a control for the macro variables. Therefore, in this regression, the beta 1 coefficient is the effect of the orthogonalized sentiment, the sentiment component that is not related to the macro current level of the macroeconomy. So that's one way that we're going to present the data through those beta 1 coefficients, okay? And the second one is to do it in two steps. And in the two steps, so any two-step procedure is less efficient statistically than the one-step procedure, but this also is more illuminating, and we have it for pedagogical reasons. Essentially, we run the regression, a regression of the sentiment on the left-hand side, the total sentiment on the fixed effects and the macro variables. And that's the first grouping that gives us the country level economic sentiment, the component of the sentiment driven by the macroeconomy, and the residual by construction is orthogonal to the macroeconomy, and therefore is what we call the pure sentiment or the orthogonalized sentiment. And what we want to focus on is how that orthogonalized sentiment component, that in principle should have no effect on the economy, to what extent it does have an effect. Okay, so we do it in the two ways, in either going back is in equation 1 is one regression, and the second one in splitting it into the sentiment and looking at the effect of the two components of the sentiment on the investment and other effects on the market. The other thing I want to mention at this point, I talked about equation 1 as being a time series regression. If we just do it on one country at a time, we don't have enough data to get any statistical significance of the beta coefficients. So what we do is we group together all these time series regressions in a panel regression, and that's through that we gain statistical power. Okay, we talked about this. Okay, so I'll skip a couple of things. And then we talk about something that we are asked by reference to those VARs. But these VARs do not distinguish between the two components of the sentiment, so they are not illuminating in that respect. Basically, sometimes we are told our parents to do things that we hate to do, and we do them because they are our parents. In this case, they are referees. So I'll skip the VARs. Okay. 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 So this there are many tables along these lines. The results are very similar and tell us the whole story. So we look at how sentiment affects productivity. And for the full sample, yes, it is there, but it doesn't tell the story you want to tell. So what we do is we look at separately the first group, in this case, the G7 countries, and then the non-G7 countries. And you see that the sentiment, the orthogonal component of the sentiment, basically, has no effect on productivity in the advanced economies in the next year or up to 4 years ahead. So this starts telling us the story. So the story is that sophisticated investors see that the sentiment not grounded on the macroeconomy is based, for example, on the mood of the people and should have no real effect in the economy. And this is what we find in the top panel with respect to productivity. We see a very different picture for the second grouping, the next 11 OECD countries that are non-G7 countries, that the sentiment has an effect, is statistical significant for 1, 2, up to 4 years ahead. The reason we did not go beyond 4 years is because we have a relatively short sample, so we stopped at 4 years. But you can tell from that that for the non-G7 countries, the orthogonal component of the sentiment pulls people, has an effect on productivity for as far ahead as 4 years. Okay, all right. So we do a variation here because we are very painfully aware about the ad hoc nature of this grouping. So we expand the G7 group to include Switzerland and the Netherlands and take them out of the 11 countries. And what we get here is the same results. Okay, for the top panel, there is no short or long-term effect of the sentiment on productivity. We see a statistically significant effect in the second panel for up to 4 years and beyond. So what we do, we said, well, there are many more countries than those two total 21 countries. So here what we do is we retain the largest advanced economies, the top group, the smaller group, which is what we have presented already. But here we add a third group, the smallest, okay? All the non-G7 OECD countries. And what we do, as I'll show you, is that in the smallest countries that we expect the biggest effect because people are the least sophisticated, indeed, we get the strongest result. So the second panel is the G7 countries, what we discussed earlier, no effect. The top panel here is the intermediate countries that we consider, and the third one is the smallest, the least advanced countries, and we see the strong, very strong effect there as well. Okay. So we do additional tests. Oh, okay, so in case even by sort of varying around the definition of the group is pretty ad hoc. So we also do a test in a way that I like the most, is this one. So what it does is we work with the full sample at the same time. So we are not subject to the ad hoc nature of grouping countries into more and less advanced countries. So the top row shows that sentiment plays a role, but that doesn't tell us if it comes from which countries, the more or the less advanced, because they are all the countries together. But what we do, and that what is important in this table, is the second row, that we interact the sentiment with the measure of financial development. And there are several measures, but we pick one that was suggested by Rajan and Zegalis, the per capita income. We also look at another measure, which is capitalization of the stock market divided by the GDP, and we get similar results. But here we see that our proxy for financial development interacted with the sentiment is negative. What does it say? That the sentiment top row affects productivity, but the effect is lower, less significant for countries that are more financially developed. Okay, so that addresses the question, and maybe this should be the first table instead of doing the grouping of countries, as we said before. Here we do it in a way that we do not group the countries in an ad hoc way, but we interact the sentiment with a measure of financial development. So the result holds that the more financially developed a country is, the lower the effect of sentiment on productivity. Okay. Now, again, up to this point, if you could answer you ask your question, says I'm going along, you would wonder whether the measure of the orthogonal component of the sentiment has the correct interpretation. Because even though we look specifically at the component of the sentiment that is orthogonal to macro variables, there could be other variables in addition to the macro variables that rationally forecast investment and productivity. So there is that criticism. So we want a measure of the sentiment that we can safely say that is not affected, is not driven either by the macro variables or anything else that makes sense in the current state of the economy. So what we do is we look at an instrument for sentiment based on the weather, okay? And we can confidently say that the weather today, it does not is not something that is based on anything observed in the economy that affects future growth and productivity, but is totally exogenous. So in that sense, a very good instrument. So we exploit the well-known positive effect of sunshine on investor mood and behavior. And sunshine has been used extensively in earlier research as a measure of sentiment. And there are a couple of caveats with that. Now, you may say that, okay, rainfall is bad for the mood of the people, but is good for agriculture. But all the countries that we consider have the contribution of agriculture to the total GDP is very small, so you don't have to worry about that effect. Okay, so this is just following earlier literature. Now, if you look at the United States, you ask the weather where? The East Coast, the West Coast, the central part of the country has many different readings of the weather. So following their literature, for example, in the US, we look at the weather closest to the financial center, in this case, New York, and do the same thing for the other countries. Okay, so let me show you the results. For the full sample, okay, this is not the relevant one, but for the two groupings, using our nice instrument, the sunshine being high sentiment, we see the results are the same as before. In the top panel, sentiment, the weather, and the residual from our previous discussion has no short or long-term effect, statistically speaking, on productivity, while in the non-G7 countries, again, the weather does have a strong effect. Okay. Okay, this is, I'm a little behind, so I'll skip some effects. Okay, this shows you what I have shown you for productivity in the form of a table. We have corresponding tables for other left-hand side variables, but I'll show you that in terms of figures. The real consumption growth, the blue is the G7 countries. You see the effect is small and dissipates quickly. For the non-G7 countries, the effect is stronger and takes longer to dissipate. For employment growth, the same story. In the effect on the G7 countries, the effect of sentiment on the G7 countries is small and dissipates quickly. It is bigger and persists longer for the non-G7 countries. The same for GDP growth. And so the roundup is that the orthogonalized sentiment in the G7 countries does not predict productivity, weakly predicts growth. Consistent with story number 2 is that the hypothesis, it has a short-term effect, while in the non-G7 countries predicts future productivity and predicts large economic growth consistent with the story number 3. What is the effect of sentiment on stocks? Well, first let's look at the results and explain that. The orthogonalized, for the top panel, for the G7 countries, the orthogonalized sentiment negatively predicts returns in the first year, but nothing statistically significant thereafter. The interpretation of that is that the orthogonalized component of the sentiment, yes, raises prices, but within the first year, people realize that that effect should not be there. So there's a correction within the first year. So you see that the correction occurs in the advanced economies within the first year. By contrast, in the non-G7 countries, the orthogonalized sentiment takes longer for the people to realize that it should have no effect, and the correction in statistically significant ways occurs in year 2 and year 3. So this is all consistent with our basic story. Then we have other left-hand side variables, for example, equity. If the sentiment is high and therefore it pushes prices up, then firms that need to raise capital, they are going to raise capital through the equities market instead of short-term credit or bonds. And we see what happens in the two groups of countries. In the top panel, the orthogonalized sentiment, which is very short-lived, has a very short-lived effect, and the effect is small. You see, it has no effect on whether firms issue equity or debt. By contrast, in the non-G7 countries, in the second panel, you see that high sentiment affects the equity to credit ratio in years 1 and 2. This is all consistent with our story. Capital formation, it has no effect on the G7 sentiment has no effect on the G7 countries. It has an effect in 1 year for the first year on the non-G7 countries. So in further tests, we address the following additional questions. Are G7 markets actually more efficient? All our results point to the direction to answer yes. Does sentiment produce shifts in expectations? Yes. Does sentiment affect global capital flows? No. Hey, wait a minute. Why is that so? Because global capital flows typically come from the advanced economies to the less advanced economies and not in the other direction. So since these more advanced economies are not fooled by sentiment, then the effect of capital flows is negligible. Okay. Okay. So I'm skipping some things because we are short on time. Okay, we discussed that. The other issue that has been raised is, is it, what is the channel by which sentiment affects the macroeconomy and consumption? Is it that high sentiment makes investors less risk averse? Well, so that was something suggested by Campbell and Cochrane. But if it were the case, then we can look at the bond market and how high sentiment predicts future long-term government bond yields, and we find no effect there. So I think we are able to distinguish that the sentiment does not work through the channel of changing risk aversion of the investors. Now, the price-dividend ratio is a topic that I'll mention here, but you have the slides so you can study on your own. Basically, a proxy for sentiment is the price-dividend ratio. Now, the question arises, why should I use the price-dividend ratio as a proxy for sentiment, given that I can have the consistent measure provided by the OECD? But in any case, there's a lot of earlier research that uses as a proxy for the sentiment, the price-dividend ratio. And again, the left-hand side is a price-dividend ratio that you can decompose into the component based on the fundamentals and the component that is based on pure orthogonal component. And effectively, you find the same results. But again, I raise the question again. We already have a direct measure of the sentiment, the total sentiment, and decomposing it into the component based on the macroeconomy and the orthogonal component. Therefore, I don't think it adds anything, but we have a section in the paper doing that so as to link our results with the earlier literature. If you are convinced with our results, then there is no point in looking at this section. So I'll conclude here by looking at previous literature has proposed three competing views: that sentiment, that at least the orthogonal component is spurious, is short-term, and is self-fulfilling. In this paper, we disentangle these stories, exploiting the cross-country variation. This is how we can tell the story, because we are looking at contrasting the advanced to the less advanced economies. And for the G7 countries, sentiment creates a small overpricing, followed by a faster correction, has a small and transitory effect, and correspondingly has no effect on future productivity. For non-G7 countries, we find that sentiment creates large overpricing, followed by a slower correction, has a large and lasting effect on growth, and correspondingly is followed by higher future productivity. And this is the first paper to find empirical evidence for this mechanism by exploiting the variation across countries. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions, and I'll keep answering questions as long until Georgios tells me to stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Constantinides. This was really interesting and illuminating, and I must say, pretty innovative as well. We have quite a few questions, which is a good thing. I will probably start with one more technical and one more philosophical, if you wish. The philosophical one is both by me and by an anonymous member of the audience, whose name I cannot see at least. So in an older literature called Happiness in Economics, it was shown that some nations are likely to be grumpier than others, in the sense that they will never say, I'm happy, even if, they are. So in that literature, I remember that one would need to remove that cultural component of happiness if they wanted to compare across nations. I'm guessing, since your primary result is based on the orthogonal component, which does exactly that, it removes the business cycle element of sentiment. Is it likely that for nations that are in general unhappier and have very small changes in sentiment, that could justify why you see a big effect for those countries and a small effect for the G7 ones?
Well, you're addressing the question of the level of the sentiment, but we look at the changes in the sentiment. So effectively, we correct for that. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, and I'm guessing when you observe,
and the other thing is that effect is completely absent when we instrument sentiment with the weather. Okay.
Which
of course, you can say that some people are in some countries get more depressed when it rains than in other countries, but we are confident that using the OECD measure of the sentiment, and also by looking at the changes in the sentiment, and also looking at the weather, we have a good measure of the sentiment. Incidentally, I invite the audience to suggest additional instruments for sentiment. We thought of sort of a country wins a soccer competition, and that makes everybody happier in that country, and it does, or a song wins in a music competition. The problem is that these kind of occurrences are sparse and rare, so we would not have many data if we used anything like that. but we are still open to looking at other proxies, other instruments for sentiment.
Okay. I mean, your answer is close to a couple of follow-up questions. I mean, it's the endogeneity policing question, whether it's really a good instrument in the sense that there is literature. I mean, I know of one paper by Ben Jones at Kellogg that shows a direct effect of weather and sunshine on economic growth, productivity, and the rest. So I'm guessing you already answered that you're open to suggestions for for a better instrument in that sense. Another set of questions are wondering whether there are implications that are more finance related. So, for instance, is it likely that there are implications for credit or foreign direct investment? I mean, I have noted one of the first questions saying, does your theoretical framework predict the negative sentiment should result in a shift towards credit, while positive sentiment could result in a shift towards equity? And is it likely that higher sentiment nations attract more foreign direct investment?
Well, some of the effects are financial effects. I talked about the equity to credit ratio for financing new investments. That's a finance effect, that if the sentiment is high, you expect the stock prices are high, and that's firms choose to raise capital through equity than debt. I also look directly at the returns, and they do affect, they raise the price, and there is a correction, but the correction happens within the year for the more advanced economies, and it takes longer in the less advanced economies. Yeah, so the financial implications, also the consumption affects consumption as well.
One more technical question, if I may, and I think that was mine when I was reading the full paper, is that the effects, the economic magnitude of the effects that you're presenting seems to be rather small. I mean, if I saw the numbers correctly, it seems to be around 4 or 5%, not percentage point, but percent effects. Are these effects big or small, and do they matter? I mean, in the old days, we used to say if it's no more than 10%, then is it worth discussing? Is this the magnitude? Is my understanding of the magnitude correct? And is it likely that they're small?
I mean, we look at the effect on many variables. So let me see. Let me find one example here. I mean, okay, frankly, I have not, we focused on statistical significance, and we stress to our students that we should not get hung up on STARS, statistical significance, but economic significance. And I have not thought about it. What do those numbers mean in terms of, do they make much of a dent? And that's a question I should, it was a mistake, an omission, and we should look at economic significance.
No, in many ways, even a small effect on productivity, because increasing productivity is a black box. It's true that even if they are small in magnitude, even a small effect on productivity could actually matter a lot, for countries. So perhaps it's something, worth elaborating a bit.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, investment, different change in investment as a percentage of the average investment, it does that pass the 10% rule? I'll have to look at that. That's a very original point that I haven't really thought about, but that's a good point.
Probably we have time for one or two, 1.5 last questions. One was related to the impact of the global financial crisis, I guess, in 2008. The original question was asking whether that could be seen as an exogenous shock. I'm guessing not, but it could be interesting to, are there any differences, and have you checked if there are any differences in periods before and after the crisis, period of high positive and high negative sentiment?
It's a pretty short time series, so it's kind of tricky to divide it into post and after. Yeah, but yeah, we have not done that because we thought our sample was small. And of course, we have the COVID crisis, and in 15 years from now, someone can look at before and after the COVID crisis.
And
But
that's actually,
done that.
there's a really modern and interesting point by an anonymous attendee saying that there's a recent paper in the Review of Finance where they use Spotify music sentiment as an instrument. Spotify is a music platform, and apparently one can get, mood indicators based on Spotify. I'm guessing that would be for the more recent years because Spotify has been out there for the last decade or so, probably.
Oh, okay. As an instrument for sentiment. So, okay.
As a
I, I, I'm, I'm not very familiar with Spotify, but it is worth pursuing. That's a good point. Thank you.
And probably a short final one, since we mentioned Spotify. There was one question by Stoyan Yankovic in the beginning of the presentation saying if you have any opinion on coinciding and leading indicators for the Eurozone, such as the ESI and the PMI, which I'm guessing are Eurozone-based indicators. You might or you might not, but just in case, if you have come across them, do you have an opinion on them as
It's economic indicators based on what? I missed that.
These are leading economic indicators for the Eurozone, I guess used to analyze economic fundamentals, just in case you have come across them. But if you haven't, then that's fine.
Well, okay, yeah, we are fully aware that the total sentiment has a rational component based on the macroeconomy and the orthogonal component that we're focusing. You're saying that to eliminate the effect of the rational component, in addition to the macro variables, I look at some other economic forecasts. Is that it? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yes. Okay.
I think
I have more time, and it's up to you when you want to end this. It's up to you.
I mean, probably, yeah, we can consider one more point, and I guess unless Michelle and Cesario tell us that we should stop here, it's really up to Michelle.
I think you can take one more. We are seeing that participants are leaving the Zoom room likely because they have something at the top of the hour. But this, I mean, clearly we have a lot of questions coming in about this. It's such an interesting topic. So, if you're able to, I'm sure we can take one or two more.
There's one by Nilanjana Chakraborty asking, is it likely that sentiment influences less advanced economies more, I guess, because it drives the market more due to lack of precise information? I'm guessing it has to do with informational, lower quality of information, and that makes them more prone to sentiment effects. Is it likely?
That's the lower quality of information is a very important aspect of it. Is not necessarily that the people analyzing the market in those countries are less smart, but the information that they get is more noisy, and therefore they are not able to disentangle the rational component and the pure sentiment component. Yes, that's is the noisiness. Yes, that is important. Yes.
If I can add something, because that is a question from one of our colleagues from the research network, Luis Vicente from University of Zaragoza, and he asked about the national cultural values, if they could be influential and affecting the sentiment of the country. And in the second part of the question, is asking why just using economic financial issues to make it country groups and not, for instance, use as well these national cultural values. Do you think that there is any value added to do so, or is out of the scope of the paper? What is your...
Can you elaborate? What are the other
because
variables?
basically our colleague asked if it will be as a proxy to sentiment to use as well national cultural values and not use only economic and financial issues. So if cultural values, cultural proxies will be important and relevant to split the countries in terms of sentiment.
I mean, if we have a consistent measure of that, I mean, it would be very simple. Like I told you, my most favorite one was the one that I do not split the countries, but I interact them with, this one on page 32, that I interact the sentiment with per capita income as a measure of financial development. We could use instead a measure that has nothing to do with finance, something about culture. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we could do that. Even religion, maybe, I don't know. But so
could be.
If I were to leave you with one table, because don't remember many things, but you remember one table. This is the one. So I did not pass judgment, and here may offend some people that what is my country is less advanced. I don't know. So here you have them all, and you have the per capita income as a measure, and we tried other measures, but we could definitely try some cultural measures as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is another comment. I believe that is not possible to do so, but I have the right to be wrong. And he's asking if it's possible at some extent to distinguish between the sentiment of domestic investors from the international investors. So that's the question comment of one of the participants.
Yeah, well, we have tests that we recognizing that the U.S. being the largest and has the largest stock and bond markets influences all the other countries. So we have tests also that did not present here that we look at the economic development of a country, sort of investment and so forth, based on the U.S. sentiment. Yeah, yeah, we have those tests, and they are very significant. Yes.
Oh, that's great.
And the channel for that is that international investment comes primarily from the U.S. and flows to those less advanced countries, as opposed to the reverse direction of flow.
That's great. Thank you. I think that overall we covered by areas most of the questions. If Georgios, do you agree with me, or do you have anything else
Yeah,
to?
certainly, certainly. And I think the point on the cultural values is a very good one. They're suggesting a Hofstede scale, but it's also very close to the happiness question in the beginning, where you kind of mentioned that this is part of the fixed effect, or that because you measure changes, it should matter less. But yeah, all in all, I think we covered the questions quite well.
Nevertheless, as we said in the beginning, we'll pass all the questions to Professor Constantinides. If somehow we miss some relevant comment or question, I believe that Michelle will be kind to do so. And I think that we are finishing our seminar. On behalf of FEBRN, I just want to thank you very much to Professor Constantinides for his availability to be with us today, and we hope to repeat in the future, and we hope you to accept again our invitation in the future. It was really a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, all of
very
you,
much.
for the opportunity to present a paper, and thank you for giving me some very important questions to think about. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
day.
Thank you.
Thank you.